This is a PowerPoint presentation prepared for the Indigenous Caucus of the CMC on shared governance of Wood Buffalo National Park. It's intended to share information that's been provided to date by the Indigenous governments and help lay some of the groundwork for a planned workshop that will take place in Fort Smith at the end of August. My name is Alex Carr and I work with Envision Insight Group. We are an Indigenous consulting firm with majority Indigenous ownership and staff, including First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Envision was hired under contract by the Indigenous Caucus to support the IGs and facilitate a process to identify elements of a shared vision, principles, and possibilities for participating in a shared governance arrangement for Wood Buffalo National Park. Next slide. In 2022, the Indigenous Caucus agreed upon a three-phase process to help it move towards a common vision of shared governance, as called for by the World Heritage Committee. The three phases are described in this slide. Phase 1, which is just being completed, involved community consultations carried out in 2022 and 2023. In this phase, each community was to undertake its own consultations and engagement with leadership, members, land users, and others as needed. The focus was to be on identifying the vision for Wood Buffalo National Park, principles and ideas about shared governance and management. This phase resulted in community consultation reports produced by 7 of the participating members of the Indigenous Caucus. Following the completion of community consultations, Envision has produced a summary report, and this was recently distributed in July 2023. Phase 2 is intended to bring members of the Indigenous Caucus together through a few facilitated workshops to share their visions and ideas about shared governance and management of the park and principles to underpin this. Workshops are scheduled now in August at the end of the month and also in October, and the outcomes of that are expected to be a workshop report that reflects areas of common ground and consensus where possible. And then the final phase, phase 3, involves preparing for discussions and negotiations with Canada, the timing and process of which is, of course, to be determined. Next slide. Through consultation reports and in one-on-one discussions, the Indigenous governments shared their histories and experiences within the lands now encompassed by Wood Buffalo National Park. They also identified measures like reconciliation actions to address the history and experiences of Indigenous peoples in Wood Buffalo since its establishment. In addressing the period prior to the arrival of Europeans, pre-contact, the IGs spoke in different terms to the spiritual underpinnings of relationships with land, water, with animals, and with each other, and the significance of these relationships to governance and management. The Indigenous governments also shared experiences and histories post-contact. These encompass recollection of direct and intergenerational experiences of the people through periods of colonialism, assimilation, dispossession and dislocation, as well as treaty making and the profound legacies of these experiences. It's apparent that there are both shared and common experiences and histories with Wood Buffalo, as well as highly unique and individualized experiences. No one of these is more or less important than another. However, these histories, experiences, and spiritual understandings of relationships are critical to thinking about what shared governance and shared management of Wood Buffalo might look like in the future. There was a lot shared in the community consultation reports and through one-on-one discussions regarding the frustrations and disappointments that Indigenous governments now have with the CMC. These include, for example, a lack of credibility and investment in the CMC as a forum generally for dealing with co-management issues of the park. The CMC is not seen as an appropriate structure, partly because it combines Indigenous leaders working with Parks Canada officials rather than establishing leader-to-leader structures and officials-to-official structures. The impacts of tactics used by Canada that have the effect of fostering division and disunity amongst the IGs are not viewed favorably. And this includes things like the repeated introduction of bilateral issues at the CMC and that table, where these issues are not seen to belong at what is essentially a common and shared table. Concerns are also expressed around the under-resourcing and lack of accountability for the expenditure of funds. And this was mentioned most often in connection with the way the action plan is being implemented, whereby Canada allocated resources but has not necessarily used these to better engage Indigenous peoples in parks management. Overall, the approach that's promoted by the CMC is seen as one of indigenization, whereby parks brings Indigenous elements into the park management. For example, through hiring, but doesn't really change underlying structures, systems, or ways of managing the park. There are also lots of issues related to parks management. These include, for example, lack of participation in some species management, in fire management, etc. Nonetheless, there is goodwill amongst the Indigenous governments to pursue common cause, although that's recognized as being balanced against other priorities that all the IGs have. So there are many other processes that draw the time and limited resources and capacities of the Indigenous governments away from participating in the CMC. Next slide. Here we're going to shift gears a little bit to start to talk about the future and possibilities for shared governance of wood buffalo. We wanted to begin by introducing to the Indigenous Caucus a proposed shared governance framework. This framework has been developed to support discussion of what shared governance might look like, and we will present that in slides that follow. However, a goal is that through this process, the Indigenous Caucus will gain clarity on areas of common ground, those being areas of consensus, areas where there's potential common ground that can be built. For example, there is emergent consensus, but further discussion and looking at creative solutions is required. And also identifying issues in areas where there's either no or limited common ground, and that will therefore need to be further addressed through processes to be determined. Next slide. The next part of this presentation introduces a shared governance framework, which can potentially be used by the Indigenous Caucus as you move forward with developing a common vision of what shared governance of the park might look like, and also to sharpen some of the details around key elements of that vision. This slide shows some of the main components of that framework. It includes vision and goals for the future of the park and for participation in governance and management, principles to guide relationships, including among the Indigenous governments and between the Indigenous governments and the federal government and Parks Canada. Mandate, referring to what would be the strategic approach to shared governance on the part of the Indigenous governments. And importantly, what types of issues would be dealt with collectively by the IGs and with Canada through shared governance structures and procedures. And it's important to note here that this also involves thinking about what issues would not be dealt with on a shared governance basis. That is, those issues that would be dealt with on a bilateral or a limited multilateral basis. Shared governance structures and procedures are a key element of the framework, and this would involve looking at what key decision-making structures would need to be established, as well as advisory and other structures, and how key procedures would be carried out, including decision-making, the development and approval by all parties of key strategies, policies, and plans for the park. Stewardship and management is a large area that potentially can be unpacked. It relates to how the park will be managed and operated, and how operational matters will be dealt with on the ground. And that includes things like how monitoring is carried out and how regulation of land use and access is done. Accountability and reporting refers to how the federal government will report publicly and to Parliament, and also how the Indigenous governments will report and be accountable to those they represent. For example, members and citizens, land users, and future generations. And finally, implementation relates to a number of things. First, how Indigenous government participation in a shared governance framework would be supported, if there's a need for a secretariat type body, and also what types of agreements and legal mechanisms would be needed to underpin the shared governance regime. So using this framework, through the next few slides, we hope to report to the Indigenous Caucus on areas of common ground, potential for building common ground, and areas where there is presently no or limited common ground. Next slide. There's a high degree of commonality amongst the IGs with respect to elements of a vision for shared governance. This vision includes revitalization and restoration of rights and relationships with the land, waters, with culture, and with bison, and the exercise of land and resource access and use. The Indigenous governments have consistently used terms like redress and restitution when talking about the vision. Redress is generally tied to reconciliation actions, but it extends from immediate measures such as apologies through to more meaningful and sustained participation in park governance and management in the longer term. The vision as it relates to restitution is framed in terms of restoring what has been lost, weakened, or undermined, including, for example, a way of life, knowledge systems, the application of traditional and Indigenous laws and protocols, and therefore systems of governance, as well as knowledge transmission intergenerationally. Other elements of the vision which were identified, although a little less commonly, include realizing equality of rights and removing inequalities and divisions, restoring traditional protocols, establishing relationships that are based on trust and accountability and credibility within the Crown Indigenous relationship. The vision also encompasses involving youth in realizing the vision and goals of shared governance for the future, supporting good relationships in the community and amongst the Indigenous governments, ecological, cultural, and social integrity and continuity, as well as having meaningful and effective structures. Next slide. In addition to the vision, the Indigenous governments have identified related goals. Shared governance is seen as a pathway to self-determination and the exercise of inherent rights, treaty rights, and other Section 35 constitutionally protected rights. There is common ground around the goal of achieving meaningful and effective inclusion in park management and operations. The Indigenous governments do not see shared governance as just about participating in higher level governance processes and structures, but very much so in implementation, operations, day-to-day and on-the-ground management. This means inclusion in management processes such as budgeting, hiring senior parks officials, and related. It also means participation in core operational activities such as wildlife and species related planning, fire management, and monitoring and enforcement. Goals are expressed for effective shared governance structures and procedures. This includes a goal of achieving clarity on issues to be addressed collectively and multilaterally, and those that would be addressed on a bilateral or a limited multilateral or regional basis. Effective shared governance structures goals also include ensuring that ministerial decisions reflect agreement with and consent of the IGs, having distinct leadership level structures and technicians level structures and processes, and ensuring that there's participation in monitoring, enforcement, and compliance as an important aspect of park governance. Finally, the Indigenous governments have clearly identified goals around reconciliation, redress, and restitution measures, which include truth-telling, apologies, compensation, renaming the park, and culture and youth-focused initiatives. Next slide. Consensus needs to develop around the overarching principles that will guide relationships between the Indigenous governments, as well as relationships with the federal government and Parks Canada. There needs to be exploration of what these principles mean in practice. Just to remind everyone, the current CMC principles include equity, transparency, respect, meaningful contributions, and cooperation. Principles commonly identified in community consultation reports are shown in the table on this slide. We've grouped them as closely as possible with the CMC principles that are set out here as well. But in reality, they're definitely more nuanced than the principles that are now used to guide the CMC. And I'll just quickly go through what those are. With respect to recognition and respect, the IGs emphasize mutual respect and recognition, respect for treaties and TLE agreements, recognition of stewardship responsibilities, recognition of rights, recognition of Indigenous and traditional and natural law, and recognizing and respecting good relationships. In terms of equity and equality, what we see in the community consultation reports is an emphasis on the equality among rights holders, equality as decision makers in the governance of the park, equality of authority and jurisdiction within a co-governance and management regime, equality of Section 35 rights, and equity in terms of outcomes. With respect to cooperation, which is a CMC principle, the IGs have emphasized collaborative and cooperative management, working together and working apart. So this can be seen as the recognition of the need to have a multilateral and bilateral dimensions to governance of the park. Sharing of the land is for everybody, cooperation through reciprocity and mutuality, and demonstrating trust and transparency, as well as inclusivity, which can support cooperation. And finally, there are other principles that are identified. Importantly, many of the IGs emphasize the importance of being guided by Indigenous teachings and values, which include humility, honesty, and some of the related teachings, consent, and related to that, implementation of UNDRIP and FPIC. Accountability is certainly something that was identified in the reports as an important principle, and reconciliation as a common theme throughout all the reports. Next slide. The questions that IGs addressed in community consultations did not specifically include a focus on how best to strategically pursue shared governance and what pathways might be laid down and taken. However, this is ultimately a really important question, and although it was not addressed directly by the IGs, some strategic directions are evident in what was shared, though there are slightly different points of emphasis within each Indigenous government's perspectives on these matters. So some common elements or common ground among the IGs with respect to a strategic approach to shared governance are that this should be co-developed by the IGs in Canada, that it should be based on a decolonizing approach and should involve a clear break from the past with significantly recalibrated governance arrangements. And these arrangements need to be fundamentally different from the status quo. The suggestion is that Wood Buffalo National Park should be re-established as an Indigenous park, which aligns it with the emergent idea in Canada and that we're seeing in other parts of the world of Indigenous protected and conserved areas, sometimes referred to as IPCAs. The First Nation perspective is that the treaty and treaty relationships provide the overall strategic framework within which features of shared governance are and should be defined. The positions put forward by IG suggest a strong leaning towards a strategic approach to shared governance that leads to true equality between the Indigenous governments and the Crown governments, or Crown government in this case. This equality would be reflected in decision-making processes and in respect of a wide range of matters touching on governance, management, and administration of the park. I guess to put this simply, the equality that is sought is that the Indigenous governments and the ministers would be on a completely level playing field when it comes to decision making, meaning decisions cannot be made final by only one party. Next slide. The question of issues management is very central to the concerns of the Indigenous governments around shared governance of the park. There is agreement that only matters and issues that are common to all IGs should be brought within the scope of mandate established for a shared governance table or structures and processes. Examples of the types of issues that could be addressed through shared governance include park-wide planning, broad plans for species management, such as bison and crane, and strategic things like strategies and policies, including for example, benefit sharing in the area of procurement, hiring and employment, and related matters. And those were some of the things that were identified by the IGs. However, there is a view that issues related to how these plans and policies and strategies are operationalized and implemented should be subject to bilateral or, in some cases, limited multilateral processes and arrangements. And that's a pretty clear message coming through from the consultation reports and through the one-on-one discussions that Envision had. It was anticipated that community consultation reports would provide more information on your perspectives as to what constitutes common and shared issues that would be dealt with through a shared governance regime, and what remains in the category of bilateral or even limited multilateral issues. Clearly, there's a need for more discussion and work around this matter, and that is something that we will address at the August workshop. Next slide. Findings from phase 1 of this work suggest that some of the following features and characteristics of shared governance are put forward by the Indigenous governments. First, a shared governance model for Wood Buffalo should encompass separate but interrelated leadership structures and technical officials level structures. And that's a theme that you probably have heard throughout this presentation. Second, within shared governance structures, there should be equality of representation. Though what exactly this looks like has not been really well defined, and like other matters, requires further discussion. Third, shared governance structures should be adequately resourced and supported through a secretariat type body. So these are areas of common ground amongst the IGs in terms of their perspectives on shared governance structures. Another element that was emphasized, which is sort of related to structures, is that Indigenous priority hiring into parks-related jobs at all levels, but especially at senior management levels, is required. So this might include the park warden superintendent positions, and it also encompasses the idea of Indigenous government's direct participation in the selection of other senior officials. While the specific structures of shared governance for Wood Buffalo Park are not yet evident, there are many models that can be considered by the IGs as you move forward in your discussions. And these come from some of the priority models that were actually identified by you as models of interest. And they include Thaidenenene, Guayhanas in BC, the Torn Gap Mountains in Labrador, and also in other national parks across the country and in national park reserves, some of which are in the NWT. Envision has information available on these other models, which we can share and which we will introduce as appropriate as we get into more detailed discussions of features of what shared governance might look like. Next slide. Governance is ultimately about decision-making, and on this matter, the Indigenous governments appear to agree and support some of the following procedures. First, recognizing that decisions should be based on consensus and mutual agreement. Decision-making must be founded upon and consistent with agreed-upon principles, including those that are related to respect, recognition, and honoring relationships of reciprocity with the natural world. Decision-making should be transparent. It should be guided by Indigenous worldviews, knowledge systems, relationships, and stewardship. Decision-making should be undertaken through structures and procedures that provide for equal representation of the Indigenous governments and equality with the Crown government. And decision-making should consider the impacts on future generations and be forward-looking 7 generations. Next slide. Just by way of introduction to this slide on shared stewardship and management, I just wanted to say that there's a lot to unpack as it concerns what shared stewardship and management at an operational level might look like in the park. At this stage in the process, a first step may be just to identify the items that fall into this part of a shared governance regime or considerations around that. Through phase one of this process, many issues related to management and operations did surface. This slide provides a short synopsis of what was shared in this regard and areas where there's both common ground and less common ground. So just to get into that, in terms of areas of common ground or common perspective, this includes that shared management and stewardship should be guided by values, including sharing, conservation, and sustainability of resources. There should be establishment and active deployment of Indigenous monitoring and compliance or enforcement within the park, including potentially through Guardians type programming. And the issue of cultural competency of Parks Canada staff needs to be addressed as part of parks management. There's a need to address attitudes and approaches which are often reflective of racial bias, stigmas, lack of awareness of historical experiences of Indigenous peoples in the park, and of traditional land and resource use and occupancy. And finally, just a lack of knowledge or awareness of Indigenous rights and Indigenous worldviews. Areas where there's less common ground around how management and operations may occur include how in the future governance and management of the park will encompass the application of traditional protocols to how territories and resources are managed. There's also some grayness around the issue of geographic organization of the park, including the potential to move to a more regionalized or local or decentralized system of management and governance. And there are issues around the regulation of land and resource use in the park, and in particular the application of regulations and the group trapping areas. While an unaltered approach to GTAs is seen as not open for discussion by some, others feel that that issue needs to be addressed. So again, when we get into management and operations, there's certainly areas of common ground, but as we get into details, I would suggest that that is where the areas of less common ground and areas that need to be addressed in some process start to emerge. Next slide. This slide deals with accountability and reporting mechanisms, as well as Indigenous implementation support for participation in the park. Just going to deal with these two issues on a single slide. First, with respect to accountability, this was indirectly touched on by the Indigenous governments in relation to principles applicable to a shared governance system for wood buffalo. However, specific accountability structures or processes have really not been addressed fully at this time, and should be the subject of further discussion, including at the August workshop. With respect to support for Indigenous participation, there's definitely a consensus that a secretariat structure of some sort should be part of the overall structural architecture of a shared governance regime. Some Indigenous governments envision that this structure would be a secretariat that serves the IG specifically, while others are either less specific or suggest that a secretariat type structure is needed to support all the parties as they work collaboratively within the shared governance framework. There's really no disagreement on approach, but again, this matter does require some further discussion. And there are models that will support further consideration and discussion of this. For example, the NWT Intergovernmental Council on Land and Resource Management and its secretariat structures are good models to look at. And there are many other examples that we can consider. Next slide. We noted earlier that a key feature of shared governance is the set of political and legal mechanisms that underpin any arrangement. This was not an issue that was specifically considered by the Indigenous governments during phase one consultations. However, what was shared does provide some insight on what agreements may be seen as foundational. And to start with, we need to look at the constitutional foundations. So in that regard, First Nations emphasize that Treaty 8 and treaty relationships are foundational agreements and key instruments that define a system of shared governance and management for Wood Buffalo National Park. Treaties establish the foundations for shared governance, and treaty land entitlement agreements are also recognized as being important. The NWT Métis Nation is in advanced stages of negotiating a modern treaty / land claim agreement that includes provisions for participation in national parks and for lands within Wood Buffalo National Park. Some IGs noted a level of openness to discussing the use of other types of agreements and arrangements that might give shape and authority to a shared governance system for wood buffalo. And that includes new forms of sort of multilateral agreements, the use of limited multilateral agreements, for example, that would be applicable in specific regions or even areas of the park in which different Indigenous governments and groups have shared or common interests. Government-to-government agreements are another potential mechanism that was identified, as well as devolution type agreements, although some caveats around that type of agreement, of course. Beyond foundational and constitutionally protected treaty and related mechanisms, it's possible that other accords, arrangements, or other agreements, as well as laws, will need to be added and provide definition to and also be used to operationalize a shared governance framework. And I'd just say that, as is the case for other features of the shared governance framework, there are models that we can look to and that can be referenced in giving further consideration to these matters. For example, Fidenaneni is based on a series of interrelated foundational agreements. Next slide. We've reached the end of this presentation, and I want to thank you for listening to this and appreciate that there's a lot of information to absorb and think about. In terms of next steps, Indigenous caucus representatives will be participating in a workshop August 28th, 29th, and 30th for a total of 2 days of workshop time to further discuss some of the topics and issues that are covered in this presentation and related matters. There are a number of questions that Envision is suggesting be given consideration and some internal discussion by the Indigenous caucus members on an individual basis and in preparation for the group discussions that are planned for the workshop. A list of these questions will be provided separately as part of the package that's being distributed with this PowerPoint presentation. And we're very happy to follow up with any of the Indigenous caucus members individually to have further discussions on what's been presented and to provide further details as needed. So, merci, kinana skomitin. Thank you.